So let's start this meeting. Are we ready to start?
Yeah, we are ready when you want to.
Okay. This is the regular meeting of the Transportation, Mobility, and Infrastructure Commission on November 1st, 2021. Calling to order. Should we start by a roll call?
We don't need to do a roll call.
Okay. Do we have a quorum here? Out of curiosity.
Yes,
we do. Okay. Great. Thank you. Calling to order. The Transportation, Mobility, and Infrastructure Commission meeting will be conducted via teleconference pursuant to Government Code Section 54953E. On October 20th, 2021, the City Council adopted Resolution 21-80, confirming that a statewide state of emergency continues to exist because of COVID-19 virus pandemic, and that the Yolo County Public Health Officer continues to recommend measures to promote social distancing. The council and city staff shall take all actions required to protect public access and right to comment. To submit a comment in writing, please email benjaminm@cityofwestsacramento.org and write public comment in the subject line. In the body of the email, include the item number and title of the item as well as your comments. All comments must be received by 5 p.m. prior to any meeting. All comments shall become part of the record. Paraphrase, to make a verbal comment during the meeting, join the meeting via the Zoom meeting link or the phone number, which are posted on the city's website. The chair will request public comment during item 1A prior to the first item on consent and after the staff presentation for any other item on the agenda. Once the chair has announced the public comment period, if you would like to make a comment, please do one of the following. 1, if you are joining the meeting via Zoom, plus the raise a hand button, or 2, if you are joining the meeting via phone, press *9. When it is your turn to comment, the chair or the clerk will call you by name or phone number, and the city staff will unmute your microphone. You will have 3 minutes to speak. Once your public comment has ended, you will be muted again. So I'm going to move on to the General Administration Function Part 1. Section A, presentation by the public on matters not on the agenda within the jurisdiction of the Commission. Note that the Commission is prohibited from discussing items that are not on the agenda brought to them at this time. Do we have any presentations by the public at this time?
I don't have any written comment. I do see a couple names on the meeting that I don't recognize. If you wish to speak on public or item 1A, please let us know.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised at this time, so I'm going to move on to item 1B, disclosure of ex parte communications. Commissioners, is there anything that you would like to disclose, any communications on agenda items at this time? Okay, seeing none, move on to the consent agenda. Consideration of approval of the minutes of the August 2nd, 2021 Transportation, Mobility, and Infrastructure Commission meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Commissioner Hastings, motion to approve. A second?
I'll second.
Okay, a second by Commissioner Gunn, I believe.
Yep.
All in favor, say aye.
So we're going to do a roll call.
Aye.
Oh, I'm sorry, a roll call.
Aye.
Hang on, I've got to do a roll call. Apologies. All right, we'll do roll call. Commissioner Therical.
Aye.
Commissioner Cianes.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnston.
Aye.
Commissioner Lichtenstein is absent, I believe. Commissioner Kashkouli.
Aye.
Commissioner Gunn.
Aye.
And Commissioner Hastings.
Aye.
So sounds like the ayes have it. The minutes are approved. Moving on to the regular agenda. Item 3, update and presentation of data from the citywide speed survey project. It looks like we're going to be receiving a presentation and then some discussion. I don't believe there's anything to approve on this. Is that correct?
No, there's nothing to approve.
Great.
Good evening, commissioners. My name's Ariana Adami. I'm the new director of capital projects for the city of West Sacramento. I wanted to come here to introduce myself, at least from here up. Hopefully someday soon, we'll be able to meet in person. But I wanted to kick off this item because it's
recording in progress
out of Capital Projects Department. And I'd like to introduce Vin Kay, our supervising civil engineer, who will introduce our consultant. So it's nice to meet everyone, and I'll pass it over to Vin.
Great, thank you, Ariana. And good evening, Chair Zimmer and commissioners. What we have for you tonight is an informational presentation by our consultant, Mott McDonald. And then we'll follow that up with more of a project-specific presentation that sort of puts it into context. Joanna Ortiz will present the results of our project and how it relates to overall scope of things. And also with me tonight is our head of traffic enforcement, Lieutenant Jason Winger. And then Lieutenant Winger and I will be around at the end of the presentation to assist with any questions you may have. Okay, so without further ado, Ravi Narayan with Mott McDonald.
Yeah, good evening, commissioners. This is Ravi Narayanan with Mott McDonald. And thanks, Vin, for the introduction. And thanks for the opportunity to share a PowerPoint presentation we have put together to go over what we call engineering and traffic surveys, which is the technical process we use for completion of or evaluation of existing speed limits and so forth. So I'm going to take a moment and share my screen. It's a PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully, oh, it says host has disabled participant screen sharing. Can I be allowed to share?
So I will control the PowerPoint. Just let me know when you want to advance the slide.
Oh, okay.
All right. Here on 1 second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, this is the introduction. Again, I wanted to say good evening to everybody before we get into this presentation. Maybe we'll go to the next slide. So yeah, a little bit of a definition on what an engineering and traffic survey is. And it's a term that's codified in the California Vehicle Code and referenced pretty extensively in the California Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is the primary statutory and regulatory document that codifies the need for an engineering and traffic survey study as the technical basis for either establishment or updating of existing speed limit signs. So speed zones, according to the MUTCD standard, shall only be established on the basis of an ENTS, other than statutory situations such as in the residential districts and so forth, where what we call a prima facie speed limit would be used. So from a technical standpoint, the ENTS is fundamentally revolves around what we call the 85th percentile speed, and what you see from that is it's clearly a data-driven exercise in terms of looking at existing speeds through the corridor and compiling a statistical summary of the prevailing speeds on any segment or corridor that we choose to study, and we will establish posted speed limits around the 85th percentile speeds. And I'll get to those details in subsequent slides. And the MUTCD support clearly calls out two other caveats that are related very importantly, very critically to the establishment and enforcement of speed limits. And that is, it depends on the voluntary compliance of a vast majority of motorists. And if set arbitrarily low, which means if set substantially below the 85th percentile speed limits, it creates enforceability issues and generally speaking, does not command the respect of the traveling public. So those are the main caveats that we use as guiding principles when we undertake an ENTS study. Next slide, please. A little bit of a catch-up, since I use the term 85th percentile speeds, and then that's fundamental to what we study in an ENTS study. I thought this slide would be helpful for people to understand how exactly statistically the 85th percentile is kind of laid out and how it relates to how we look at the data from a overall statistical standpoint and a validity standpoint. The 85th percentile that you see is basically along that black line, which is again and again, this is a typical speed curve or speed distribution curve that we see for most local streets, and it's not for any particular street in the city of West Sacramento necessarily, but this is a typical speed distribution that we see in a vast majority of situations, and this is exactly more or less how a speed distribution for a speed survey behaves. And the 85th percentile, as you can see, statistically speaking, about 8% of the traveling population exceed the 85th percentile speed. And in a neighborhood or in a low access, medium access arterial kind of a situation, even a 5 mile per hour reduction in speeds below the 85th percentile speed pretty much more than quadruples the percentage of the traveling public that travel above that speed. From 8%, you go up to 40%, pretty much a 5 mile reduction in speed. And in this case, like anywhere from the 85th percentile is approximately 37 miles per hour. If we were to arbitrarily drop it to, let's say, 25 miles per hour, that would pretty much make about 70 or 80% of the traveling public exceed the posted speed limit. So this is a telltale as to how, why, or I should say, the 85th percentile is often used as the most reasonable maximum speed limit, at least from an enforceability and statistical validity standpoint. And then this blue band that you see is what we call a pace band, which is pretty much covers the highest 10 mile per hour range of speeds that are covered, that are representative of the vast majority of the population. So this band covers a vast majority of this. In this case, the 10 mile per hour speed band is 25 to 35 miles per hour. That captures about 75% of the total population in that band. So we can come back and revisit the slide if there are any further questions. And one other thing is the general prevailing wisdom in our traffic engineering practice is that anything about 5 miles per hour, the posted speed limit is still considered speeding. But then anything over 10 miles per hour, the speed limit is considered racing. And that is pretty much a colloquial way of looking at speed limits in a more suburban, low to medium access arterial conditions. Next slide, please. And then I'm going through my presentation here slide by slide, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions if any commissioners or anybody in our audience has a question or would like a point of clarification. I'm more than happy to talk about a particular slide more in depth or answer a question or two before we move subsequent slides. And I also have a Q&A session that we're allowing at the back end of this presentation where I'm happy to take questions or clarify items that I'm covering. But in case there's anything that comes up as I'm speaking, please feel free to stop me as well. So like I was saying, an engineering study, actually an ENTS, is as the name indicates, it's an engineering study and not a planning study. And as I mentioned, it is a data-driven exercise, and it captures the statistical behavior in terms of how the traveling public are using a particular street or a particular segment of a roadway in terms of the speeds they're using to traverse that segment. And the fundamental need and purpose and the intent of an ENTS is to help establish or update speed limits if they're already existing, and to help with enforceability because of its statistical basis and the engineering basis for the study. And what an ENTS does not do really is address any type of a planning or a community type uh, goal or intent. In terms of typical examples include traffic calming and related issues. Issues related to speeding, such as neighborhood livability, noise, and whatnot. So those are more of what we would like to see happen in a particular corridor, not necessarily what is happening out there. So an ENT is, like I say, it pretty much captures what is going on a segment of roadway, as opposed to what we would like to see happen, which is more of a planning intent. Next slide. Again, a little bit of a definition on what an ENTS is according to the California Vehicle Code. An ENTS is a highway and traffic condition study that is completed based on technical methods determined by state and relevant local lead agencies. And from a data standpoint, there are really three things that are primarily drive an ENTS, and that's the prevailing speed data that I touched on earlier. And then we look at collision records, and I'll get to the details of every one of these types of data in subsequent slides. So we have prevailing speeds, accident records, and then there's also the consideration of traffic and roadside conditions, quote unquote, that are not readily apparent to the driver. So that as an engineering professional, we look at in terms of setting an appropriate speed limit. And the top three items that you see are applicable for both state highways and local roadways. But for local agencies, the the CVC allows additional consideration of residential density, pedestrian and bicyclist safety within that is fronting the segment that's evaluated in the study. Next slide. So before we get into the ENTS specifics, there's actually several related CVC sections that are invoked and referenced ad nauseum, really, in typical speed studies and ENTS surveys. And like we touched on, Section 627 covers the ENTS definition. So Section 21400 draws reference to the California MUTCD and setting speed limits. There's, of course, the Section 22350 that invokes the basic speed law, which pretty much states that thou shalt not drive speeds that are not reasonable given the conditions. So, and then there's a prima facie definition of prima facie speed limits for residential streets that are imbibed in Section 22352. And then there are sections 22357 and 358 that allow specific downward speed zoning below the 85th percentile for school zones and other types of CBD residential streets and so forth that are incorporated in those two sections. And then Section 40802 talks about speed traps on local streets and additional considerations. So all these CVC sections go hand in hand with our ENTS evaluation. And of course, the technical guidance on how the 85th percentile speed should be used to arrive at a recommendation for a recommended speed limit is contained in the California MUTCD Section 2B13 as well. Slide. So, like I say, the primary concern, the primary item that involves that pretty much controls the posted speed limit recommendation is the 85th percentile speed. Oftentimes, it's not just, we don't simply take the 85th percentile speed and say that is the posted speed limit. The MUTCD allows two options to actually consider reduced speed limits that do not exactly correspond to the 85th percentile speed. And while we are at it, I may also reiterate that there is no scenario that's specified in the MUTCD that actually requires a local agency to post a speed limit that's higher than the 85th percentile speed under any circumstance. So, but there are multiple options to consider posting of speed limits that are up to 7.5 miles per hour below the 85th percentile speed limits. And option one is, that you see on the slide here, is the most frequently used option, again, supported by data, where we could reduce the speeds by up to 5 miles per hour below nearest 5 mile per hour increment of the 85th percentile speed. And I have a subsequent slide that'll kind of gives a case and study example as to how this math works, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the option two is the second option, where if the 85th percentile speed, if the nearest 5 mile per hour increment is a round up as opposed to a round down, then option two actually allows you to use a round down in lieu of a round up, assuming no other reduction is taken for any reason whatsoever. And with the next slide, I'd be able to explain this a little better. So, slide. That's right. Okay, so if you have an example of a prevailing 85th percentile speed on a particular segment of roadway, let's say it's 37 miles per hour. So the nearest 5 mile per hour increment for that prevailing 85th percentile speed would be 35 mile per hour. As you can see, this happens to be a round down in this case. 37 became 35. So in this case, assuming there are engineering factors like roadside conditions and development conditions, as well as conditions that are not readily apparent to the driver, such as accident rates and so forth. If there are technical reasons, then the recommendable speed limit, the minimum recommendable speed limit for that particular segment would be as low as 30 miles per hour. And technically speaking, the MUTCD and the CVC do not support going below the 30 miles per hour under any circumstance, even if you had the supporting documentation, given that the 85th percentile speed is closer to 35 miles per hour. The second situation happens when we end up rounding up. In this case, like let's say the prevailing 85th percentile speed is 38 miles per hour. The nearest 5 mile per increment ends up being 40. So in this case, we could justify 35 miles per hour in one of two different ways. We could use the same data, assuming these are similar segments. We could still use a data-driven approach to justify a 35 mile per hour speed limit, knowing that the nearest 85th percentile speed limit is 40. Or if by invoking MUTCD option 2, we could simply recommend a 35 mile per hour speed limit based on the MUTCD support with no supporting documentation and no further reduction in speed limits taken. So option 2, the advantage of option 2 is the minimal documentation requirements. The advantage of option 1 is we could technically achieve a speed limit that's up to 7 miles per hour in this particular case. The 85th percentile is 37. We are actually posting it for 30. So we have achieved a 7 mile per hour reduction in posted speed limits just based on MUTCD recommendations, status quo, and supporting documentation. But with option 2, we can more than likely achieve no more than a 3 mile per hour reduction. However, it saves us from a lot of documentation. Next slide. While we are at this topic, maybe somewhat of a little detour, and I know this is maybe a question that comes up and often gets asked in several contexts. Everything that I covered so far is the status quo in terms of CVC and MUTCD guidance that we had as of, I want to say, September of this year as well. Earlier in the early part of October, the state of California adopted Assembly Bill 43, Friedman's bill that gives some additional considerations to local agencies. Again, based on my best understanding, and we have checked with our traffic engineering peers on this one, is the applicability of AB 43 is not exactly in force until June of 2024, but then it does empower local agencies to have additional considerations in the overall scheme of things that we use for consideration of recommended posted speed limits. And the primary facet of AB 43 is the consideration for what's referred to as vulnerable pedestrian groups. And I'm trying to paraphrase here. Vulnerable pedestrian groups refer to children, senior citizens, the disabled, and the unhoused. And if anybody is interested in AB 43, there's another slide that I have that we could get into the text of it later on. Again, this is fresh off the press. I believe it has been approved and adopted as of October 2021, which is literally last month. And it allows, as you can see from the slide, it allows for adoption of prima facie speed limit of 25 miles per hour on state highways in CBD and residential districts, which is pretty much looking at any state highway in a CBD district, even if it's a state highway, it could be adopting a prima facie speed limit of 25 miles per hour. And it authorizes Caltrans and local agencies to adopt 20 or 15 miles per hour in those districts as well. And certain speed limitations, speed violations are subject to warning citations for first 30 days. And one more thing that it does is it extends the period where a pre-existing speed survey could be honored from any. It previously used to be 10 years. It extends it to 14 years. So a study that's conducted more than 7 years ago could be honored for up to 10 years previously, but now they're extending it up to 14 years. The last but not the least, AB 43 being a relatively new initiative, the impacts and ramifications of implementing AB 43 to local agencies are not yet fully known. It takes typically a couple, 3 years before we fully know what the impacts are. Next slide, please. There are also a couple of things that are going hand in glove with the AB 43 impetus, and regardless, there's a federal MUTCD updates that are being worked on at a national level. So every time there is a change in the federal version of the MUTCD, California MUTCD also goes through a commensurate update. So that process is being undertaken by FHWA at this time, and I believe there's a couple of years for that process to unfold. And AB 43 also calls for the California MUTCD to be updated, so we can be assured that there's going to be some substantial changes to the MUTCD in the next couple, 3 years, specific to the ENTS guidance. And one of the thoughts being put forth right now is to separate out state highways and local streets and provide separate guidance for those two categories of streets. Right now, there is a lot of overlap or a lot of lumping of the two, the guidance for state highways and local streets all in the same documentation. But frankly, it doesn't causes some confusion. And there's also some talk about altogether removing ENTS guidance from the MUTCD and placing it as a separate documentation for local agencies and traffic engineers to use in their practice. So again, a lot of this is just emerging topics. None of this is set in stone, but these are things that we are paying attention to as a profession and as an industry. Next slide. Now, a little bit into the nuts and bolts of what goes into an ENTS. As I covered in one of the previous slides, there are three main components of like what we could call input data that feeds into an ENTS, which is the radar speed surveys, the collision data. Typically, we collect 3 to 5 year collision data, and then there is the average daily traffic count data. So those three are the key pieces of data that feed into the ENTS study process that basically blends in a review and adoption of statutory requirements and technical requirements, including engineering analysis and field reviews. And field reviews include a site visit by a registered traffic engineer like myself. And also, we do what we call a windshield survey, or I take that back. Actually, we call it a floating survey, where I drive, a traffic engineer drives the segments at the speed of traffic to gain a perspective on how traffic actually behaves the corridor. I mean, from a driver's perspective. So we blend all these technical analysis and engineering perspectives into the analysis to prepare what we call an engineering and traffic study report. And then it's reviewed by staff and other stakeholders, including the city police department and other people who have input to provide. And finally, it's forwarded to the city council for adoption. Slide. So in terms of how exactly speed survey data is collected, and these are the different requirements and caveats that we use when we commission a speed survey data collection process on the field. We have used a traffic data collection expert called National Data and Surveying. They have data collection experience throughout the state of California, having done radar calibrated speed survey studies throughout the state for literally tens of dozens of agencies up and down the state. And we have used their technicians and their field calibrated certified equipment for the completion of the study. So use of certified calibrated radar speed guns is the primary requirement. And then where exactly the speed data is collected is we choose a spot on the segment which is representative of what goes on along that segment in a very holistic manner, without that segment itself, the spot itself, being an anomaly or not being truly reflective of what's going on through that corridor on a typical daily basis or an hourly off-peak basis. We choose a typical weekday, like a Tuesday or a Thursday in most situations. And then obviously we use free flow conditions. A lot of times it's not the typical AM peak hour of commute traffic or the PM peak hour of commute traffic, even though in some situations it could technically fall between your peak hour, typical so-called AM and PM peak hour windows of 6 a.m., 8 a.m., and 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. A lot of times we just pick these off-peak, free flow, uncongested conditions like 10 a.m. and 12 noon, assuming there is no lunchtime traffic. Sometimes we do these off-peak data collection during lunchtimes for certain segments, and then early, late afternoon, like anywhere from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. A lot of times. And then in terms of statistical validity, we collect 100 samples in each direction of travel for segments that are relatively high volume segments, and then minimum of 1 hour for extremely low volume segments, like segments that have less than 1,000 vehicles per day or 2,000 vehicles per day in some instances. So, and again, use clear dry weather conditions, usually daytime. I can't think of a situation where speed surveys were done during nighttime, even if the weather was cooperative. So we almost always pick a time between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. that's considered free flow and off peak. And normal driving conditions, no accidents, no detours, and minimal influence of adjacent intersections. We try to avoid mid-block locations that have driveway interferences and whatnot, the impact of upstream or downstream signals and stop signs and whatnot, and then no unusual physical conditions. We typically avoid horizontal and vertical curves and not try to collect data where there's any side distance issues or anything unusual that's not quite representative of how people drive that segment in general. So next slide. This is a slide that pretty much a typical summary slide. In this case, we are actually showing a slide for Del Monte Street, which we studied for the segment between Harbor Boulevard and Terminal Street. So this is the actual data that we looked at for that particular segment, just showing it as a sample case and study. In this particular case, we collected 169 samples. As you can see, the 50th percentile speeds, the 85th percentile speeds, 10 mile per hour pace speed, the number of vehicles in pace. In this case, 70% of the traffic falls with that 10 mile per hour pace speed bandwidth. And then we have percentage above and percentage below. So 25% of the traffic is actually falling above that pace width. And in this case, the 85th percentile is actually 41 mile per hour. And I believe the posted speed limit on that segment is 30 miles per hour, and there's a recommendation to increase that. We'll get to that in one of the slides, in the summary slides. But this is just an example of how a typical data collection process results in a statistically compiled summary of the data. And this is provided by our subconsultant who actually does the field data. This comes out of the field. There is no filtering out or any data. As you can see, there are some outliers here and there that you see. I mean, what you call not necessarily anomalies, but so-called statistical outliers. There's always this one odd case where the drives like 50, 60 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour posted speed limit zone. But those are still data points. If you are able to capture them, we use them. We don't pick and choose data. We look at data unless it is completely not representative of what's going on in that corridor. We consider the data in its entirety. Next slide, please. Average daily traffic counts. This is also a more routine count of the actual traffic demand on the segment. And a lot of people in the audience may actually be aware of these types of traffic counts being used in typical traffic studies and planning studies. And we use them for primarily for calculation accident rates. And I'll get to that in the subsequent slide. So the purpose of the average daily traffic count is to calculate the prevailing accident rates for over a 3 to 5 year time frame. Again, the process that we use for ADT counts is continuous 24-hour bidirectional traffic count data recording on a typical weekday. We typically try to get it on a Tuesday or a Wednesday as well. And a lot of times we try to place those posts or whatever the video equipment, whatever technology that's used is placed fairly relatively close to where the speed data is collected, even though there are a lot of times there's a little bit of a gap or a distance between the two locations. But a lot of times ADT counts are not as exacting as the exact spot where we collect the speed data. The speed data is more critical than ADT data for purposes of ENTS anyway. So, and we also look at peak hour flows and do a high-level check and validation of the ADT counts, make sure the counts are actually representative of the demands that are on the street, and it is statistically acceptable to use those counts for purposes of calculating accident rates and so forth. Next slide, please. So this is, just to show you a sample of what a ADT count data summary sheet looks like. This is your 24-hour bidirectional traffic recorded on Jefferson Boulevard between Washington Street and Linden Road. I didn't mean to intend for anybody to read these numbers, just to give you a high-level sample of what a ADT count sheet looks like. It records the data by direction in 15-minute increments over a continuous 24-hour period for both directions of travel. And then we actually plot out peak hour data by time of day and by direction. In this case, as you can see, the northbound traffic on Jefferson Boulevard is shown in blue, and the southbound traffic is shown in red. And as you can see, there's a clear reversal in the peak. The northbound peaks in the AM peak, approximately in the morning, 6 and 8 a.m., and the afternoon peaks between 4 and 6 p.m. in southbound direction, and which is to be expected on the Jefferson Boulevard corridor. That's pretty much, we all know that happens. So that tells us this data is reliable. It's good enough for purposes of the collision rate calculation. In this case, the total ADT on this segment of Jefferson is also shown here. Not that I can read it. I believe it's about 18,000 ADT here that you can see. Next slide, please. Collision data. So now, last but definitely not the least, we look at the collision data and significance of collision rates as one of the primary considerations, so-called what we call conditions not readily apparent to the driver. So, yeah, and again, MUTCD does not mix any words when they say I wish I had a slide for that. But anyways, MUTCD does support, actually, it overwhelmingly supports use of collision data as the primary definition of conditions not readily apparent driver. And what that does to us is use the collision data as the basis for recommending speed limits that are up to 5 miles per hour below the 85th percentile. And typically, we obtain the collision data from the city's police department and or the CHP database, or California Highway Patrol database by the state. That's referred to as the statewide integrated traffic record system. The city, in the case of the segments that we looked at, we received some extremely extensive police data reports forwarded to us by the Capital Projects Department that we have included in our ENTS survey report. And we also pulled similar data from the SWIDO's data system, mainly because that data comes in an electronic format, and it's easier for us to generate plots and charts and look at the data in a more visual format. And in most cases, the police department data and the SWIDO's data matched. They were in the same ballpark. Sometimes the police department is superior because it has more data, more anecdotal information, narratives, and so forth that helps us understand what's going on. And sometimes the statewide data report, the SWIDO's database is easier and more convenient sometimes because it's already electronic and helps us more analytical power. So quite frankly, we use both databases. And the data is typically compiled for anywhere from the latest 3 to 5 years. And using the actual collision data, we calculate the total accident rates on a collisions per million vehicle miles per year basis. And this is that rate unit is what is calculated using average daily traffic count data that I shared within my previous slide. And we compare these actual prevailing accident statewide rates, and that is how we determine the so-called significance of accident rate. And many situations, we actually find where there are speeding problems, the prevailing collision rates do in fact exceed statewide average rates for similar facilities. And also, it's one thing to look at collisions as statistical rates. It's also another thing to look at some cost for collisions. The two primary things that we look at are what we call primary collision factors and collision types. Primary collision factors could be speeding. It may not be speeding all the time. It could be right-of-way violations. It could be lack of controls. It could be, or it could be other reasons that have nothing to do related to roadside or highway conditions, or it could be a DUI or other types of behavioral issue as well. And collision type is the type of collision have, like whether it's a broadside, side swipe, a T-bone, whatever. There are so many other rear end, so many types of collisions that give a clue as to what exactly is going on in that corridor that we should pay attention to. So next slide, please. This is a typical summary of, and this may be a question come up as well. This is one of our segments that we actually recommended an increase in speed limit based on the 85th percentile. This is the F Street segment with 8th and 3rd Street that was that we looked at. As you can see, in this particular case, for this particular segment, vast majority of the accidents did happen during the daytime between 11 a.m. and 8 or 9 p.m. So that's where most of the accidents are happening, not necessarily during night times or off-peak times. However, as you can see, automobile right-of-way is perhaps the biggest. Almost 50% of the traffic accidents are happening because of right-of-way violations, not necessarily because of speeding. But we'll be revisiting the F Street issue in a subsequent slide as well. But this is a telltale sign that there is one intersection along that corridor that's causing all of these accidents, that intersection being F Street and 5th Street. And that intersection by itself is affecting the overall collision record for that segment. And as you can see, a vast majority of the accident broadsides. That tells you it's a control issue at that one intersection, not necessarily a speeding to the entire corridor, even though speeds are also excessive corridor, according to the 85th percentile speed. So we'd be happy to come back if there's any further questions on this one. But let's go on to the next slide. So I covered the generalities of everything that we looked at so far, in a somewhat more theoretical and high-level fashion. At this point, I want to switch gears and get into the actual segments that we studied for the city of West Sacramento over the last actually 9 to 10 months or so. We initiated the study process back in January of this year, and we did some data collection, field data collection, and so forth. Maybe next slide, please, and then we could talk about the segments. Yeah, the city commissioned us to back in March of this year. These were the segments that were chosen for evaluation of existing speed limits. A vast majority of them were in the North City, and a couple segments along Gregory Avenue and Marshall Road that we studied. We did the field data collection for these segments back in, I want to say February of this year. And then the next slide, please. And then we commissioned some additional segments, both in the North City area and the next slide, please. Actually, it's South City. This is the second set the city provided us to had us look at, and the data collection for this was done during the summer. I want to say June of this year. So we collected the speed data for all of these segments. Approximately close to 50 segments we have looked at this point in time. And we also obtained the city police department collision data for these segments, all 50 of them actually. And we were able to compile our ENTS for each one of these segments, either in a draft or final form. And I believe the first set has already been certified by council. The second set is the draft final is being submitted. So next slide. Now, this is a summary of the segments that we looked at. In the first phase, when we looked at the first approximately 18 or so segments that you see on this slide, our focus was on segments that we could, the first set priority segments that staff provided us. Our focus was on seeing if any of these would warrant a change in speed limits, and these were the ones that we were able to, the data justified retaining existing speed limits for the segments that you see before you. So that's why we are not spending a lot of time this presentation talking about these segments, because we are in fact upholding the existing speed limits on these segments. The next slide, please. In the second set, there were a few segments that were identified, and one of the one that you see in bold is Del Monte Street between Harbor and Seabrian. This is actually being recommended for a 5-mile-per-hour recommended speed limit increase based on the data. And the other segments, pretty much we are retaining existing speed limits. Next slide, please. There are 3 other segments that have been identified as well. F Street between 8th Street and 2nd Street. I kind of touched on this when we covered collision data. Then Marshall Road between Seymour, Jefferson, and F Street between Jefferson and 8th Street. These are the 4 segments in total that we have identified that are actually candidates for a speed limit change. Practically all of these, the recommended speed limit is actually higher than the prevailing or the posted speed limit. Next slide, please. Maybe we'll talk about, this is like a snapshot of what's going on with these 4 segments in terms of the data we looked at. Again, there are several other fields that are not showing in this table for sake of readability. We are just focusing on the most critical fields that we looked at. As you can see from the slide, every one of these segments is experiencing actual prevailing accident rates that exceed the statewide average rates for similar segments. So that by itself is a condition that is not readily apparent to the driver. So I mean, regardless of whether these accidents are caused by speeding or not, speed is in other words, regardless of whether speed is the primary collision factor for these accidents or not, speeding is a contributing factor for practically any instance where the actual accident rates in fact exceed statewide average rates, because collision rates exceeding the statewide average in itself is considered a matter to address, at least in part through control of speeds. And maybe we'll go line item by line item here. Like on Del Monte Street, posted speed limit is 30. As you can see, that the 50th percentile, let alone the 85th percentile, 50th percentile speed exceeds the posted speed limit. Actually, that's the case in every one of these situations. Every one of these streets, the 50th by itself is exceeding posted speed limit. And the 85th, 41 in this case. So we did the rounding, which would be 40 miles per hour. MUTCD option 1 is applied that I touched on in the earlier part of the presentation. So we are able to recommend a speed limit of 35 for that segment based on the documentation of accident rate, other considerations, including presence of trucks and so forth on that corridor. And the F Street segment between 8th and 2nd, I mean, regardless of the issue at 5th Street intersection, which we all know that intersection is I believe city has plans for signalizing that intersection, and a signal is to be expected there in the next year or two. Shervin or Joanna can speak to that. But from a data standpoint, the 85th percentile speed for that segment is 34, which actually rounds up to 35. And if we applied the MUTC option 2 or 1 for that matter, we would still be able to justify the 30 miles per hour, and which still represents a 5 mile per hour increase in speed above the posted. But again, you'd almost always see in this particular case, we are saying the recommended speed limit closely matches the 50th percentile speed. So the situation being the actual posted speed limits are even lower than the 50th percentile speeds in all of these instances. And the Marshall Road between Seymour and Jefferson, another candidate, it's the 85th percentile is 41 miles per hour. We are recommending 35 miles per hour. And this segment is actually consistent with the segment of Marshall Road to the west of Seymour Avenue that's been already posted for 35. So essentially, we are continuing that 35 mile per hour recommendation for the entire length of that corridor. The F Street segment along the westerly segment, Jefferson and H Street, has a similar issue as well. The 85th percentile is 42, and we are recommending 35, which actually ends up being a 10 mile per hour recent speed limit over what's posted out there currently. And there's also the average daily traffic demands that are shown on these segments, and other supplementary data like number of lanes and length of the segment and so forth. And that pretty much concludes the presentation, I thought. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions or clarify any things that I already touched on that I probably didn't do a great job explaining well. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of questions and comments and about this item, and I kind of want to sort of think about binning these sort of comments into 3 categories, and one is sort of discussion about what this traffic survey is showing us and what statutes allow the city to do. I think the second question is the survey has sort of highlighted, it's basically given us some data, some information about the city, and those questions, if we are limited in what can be done in terms of speed limits, what's going on in terms of a planning situation. And I think the third category is, in many cases, I think many of us have noticed that our accident rates are pretty high all over the city, and so sort of general traffic discussion would be category 3. And category 3 is a little bit off topic, I think, for this particular topic, but I think there are some data showing that, again, this might be a question for planning, but it's slightly off topic. But I do want to start with comments from the public. I do note that we have some written comments, and I want to open it up for any people who are present in this meeting or on the phone who would like to speak. I believe the public have 3 minutes to comment. So are there any members of the public present who would like to speak? And if so, please raise your hand. Okay, I don't see any hands raised at this time. If there is someone on the line who is trying to figure it out, I will keep watching the screens to see if anybody pops up, and I will call on you at that time. I do want to start though, and I'm not sure if I want to read the entire list of public comments in detail, but I do want to just acknowledge that we did receive 3 letters about this, I believe, on this topic. And one of them comes from our fellow commissioner who is not able to be present. That's Commissioner Lichtenstein. And she has expressed a high degree of concern about F Street, which I think was mentioned already once, with a very high accident rate. And we're talking about a rate that's nearly 100 times the state average. And also notes that the residential density in that area is going to be higher, as there's several apartment projects coming in with more parking, and also that we have some pedestrian and bicycle development in that area. So I just want to note that there were some concerns raised about that particular intersection by one of our commissioners, which I think is important to note. And there were some questions about AB 43, which I think have more or less been addressed, but we continue to talk that. And we can talk about planning as well. I think that's going to come up later in the discussion. We'll say that there was a second letter about that exact same intersection. So, you know, there are, you know, what's being noted here is that fast-moving vehicles are more lethal, and therefore there's concern over this particular intersection, and you know, in general, but also this particular intersection. So, you know, and some sort of skepticism on the 85 percentile rule. So I think, again, the F Street is a topic of concern for the public, and we can talk about, you know, what can and cannot be done about that. And then there was a third letter that is expressing concern about the intersection of South Fork and Bridge Drive. So this appears to be a slightly different concern in terms of it's more of a general concern over a high-speed roadway where people are crossing that roadway, and there don't seem to be a lot of, or this person doesn't feel that there are a lot of safe options for getting across. And I will say that I definitely appreciate these comments as well, because as we've seen tonight, the data are showing that we do have a much higher rate of accidents than statewide average. And so, you know, even roadways that are not slated to be increased speed limits may also be an issue. So I just want to note that we've had 3 of those letters, and these letters are posted on our website under the commission reading, and I encourage everybody who is interested in this topic to read them with our commissioners who I hope had time to read them. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I wanted to just open it up for discussion among people who are present, commissioners, and if there's somebody here who's from the public who hasn't been able to raise their hand, please do so. And Mr. McCoy, do you have a comment as well before we start?
I did want to note that it would be appropriate to just double check if anybody from the public did have additional comment, and if not, to go ahead and close the comment period and then officially take it back to the commissioners for comment.
I also believe staff wanted to give a presentation as well.
Oh, okay. So should we do that first before we have a commissioner discussion?
That would be recommended, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I did not realize that. Yes, let's have a staff presentation before we continue the discussion with the commission. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Chair Zimmer and commissioners. I was just planning to give a quick update on some specifics for the project, but you know, we can also jump to questions if you guys would like. I had a slide for questions at the end. But my name is Joanna Ortiz. I'm a junior engineer with the Capital Projects Department. And like I mentioned, I'm just going to be reiterating some of what Robbie said, and then try to answer some of the questions that I think have come up already. Next slide, please. So this project is intended to update speed limits in various streets throughout the city. The last time that the city updated the speed limits was back in 2013, and they should have been updated again in 2020, but unfortunately due to COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic, this project was delayed. In November of 2020, staff solicited proposals for professional services to complete the technical analysis for this project. And as you know, we selected Mott McDonald as the consultant. Next slide, please. So since this project was delayed, and these speed surveys are very important for enforcement, staff coordinated with the police department to select these 15 segments that we prioritize. And they're all listed here. And again, Robbie did go over some of these already. And staff did not recommend any speed limit changes to these locations. And then council did approve this on June 16th of this year. And then for this specific set of segments, staff did have to prepare an ordinance to adjust the dates listed on the municipal code, since these speed limits are listed there. Next slide, please. So after council approved the priority segments, Mott McDonald's began their data collection and technical analysis for the next set of segments. And I believe we started that data collection in July or June of this year. And so this set included 26 segments, and these were also coordinated with the police department. We tried to make sure that they were prioritized in what fit their needs. And so for this set, there are 4 that we are recommending speed limit changes. And again, Robbie kind of got into some of the technical aspects of that, but I think we can answer some of the questions relating to F Street at the end of this. And next slide, please. So just as an FYI, this project is not complete. We're still planning to continue to update segments throughout the city. There are several segments that were delayed due to concerns such as construction. For example, West Capitol Avenue, which is currently being repaved. There are a few that we didn't get a chance to include for other reasons that may be, future development, future projects that may impact the speed limits at those locations. And then with that being said, I also wanted to mention that for any segments that were presented today, in the future, if there are significant changes that impact the speed limits, city staff can go back at a later time to redo the speed surveys. Our goal is to complete these updates more frequently than every 7 years, so that as changes are happening throughout the city, we can capture that in the speed surveys. And next slide, please. So this concludes my presentation, very short. Like I said, we can answer any questions. We have quite a few people here ready to answer anything specific. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was good to hear that you may be able to go back and redo this if some planning happens or something changes. So that was very informative. Are there additional presentations? No?
No, that's it.
Okay. Well, let's open it up for discussion among the commissioners. Commissioners, do you have comments or questions? Commissioner Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Narayan and city staff for this really in-depth presentation. I think from the community residents that I speak to, this presentation has been long overdue. I have a series of questions, and hopefully that's okay to ask them. They do fall into the buckets that Chair Zimmer did ask us to speak to. The first is a basic question. So did city complaints drive the study at all, or was it just a request from city staff to update the data that we have?
I don't know, Joanna or Vin wants to take that question, but I'll take it. These segments were identified through city staff, and these are typically segments that have been ID'd, meaning identified. I mean, they were through the city's previous 2013 study. So each one of these segments have been studied approximately 7 or 8 years ago, and that's my understanding anyway. And it's a routine update of speed limits that the city undertakes every 5 to 7 years, or more frequently if they have the time and money to accomplish that. But Vin, if you'd like to help me out further information.
You are absolutely correct, Bobby. It is a routine exercise. We need to do it in order to validate the existing posted speed limit so that our police department can enforce.
Okay, and I asked that question because there is considerable discussion on the various avenues for citizens to complain about speeding, be it through calling dispatch or the City West Connect app. So I just don't, I want to make sure that pedestrian safety is included in this study, which I didn't really see from the data, because when you were a pedestrian at any of those intersections that might have been referenced in public comment, it's very, very scary to cross the road. And as the data showed, the culture of the community is to drive over the speed limit. So by not addressing and or reducing the speed, in my opinion, makes it even scarier for pedestrian. And there hasn't been great enforcement by our police department in pedestrian areas. So how are we addressing pedestrian concerns as we review the data that's being presented here tonight?
If you'd like me to take that question, then maybe the first stab at responding to that. We do look at collision data from the city's police department as well as Twitter's, and again, we investigate collision data at a segment level that are related to all types of collisions, not just pedestrian collisions. I mean, these could be vehicle-to-vehicle collisions, vehicle-pedestrian collisions, as well as vehicle-railroad collisions, for that matter. There are so many different facets to that accident data that we look at, and a lot of times we also look at other primary collision factors, such as automobile right-of-way violations or speeding. So it's not necessarily one pedestrian-driven accident or fatality that drives our decision to revise speed limits. It's among the larger collection of factors that we look at. But there are, on a case-by-case basis, there are situations. For instance, Cummins Way and 6th Street is one thing that comes to mind, where we looked at prevailing speeds, and we were able to invoke residential street considerations. We looked at residential density. We looked at presence of senior care and school zones not too far away from the segments or fronting that segment. And we went back to the MUTCD, and we're actually able to come up with a definition of residential street and local street that's consistent with the MUTCD's definition for those two streets, and we applied that to justify the prima facie speed limit of 25 miles per hour on Cummins Way as well as 6th Street. So to answer your question, Commissioner Johnston, we do look at pedestrian data, but not as directly as you may imagine. It is in the overall context of what we look at, unless it's a specific intersection level study or something else. At a segment level, it is not one crossing or one pedestrian related accident that we pay attention to. Hopefully that answers.
It does. And frankly, it angers me a little bit more, because not having an accident doesn't mean that one won't happen. There is weather to be concerned about, especially throughout West Sacramento. We have heavy fog, which means in the nighttime hours, maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, when people are trying to cross the street to stay healthy and exercise, there's a high chance of them getting hit, which has almost happened to me. There still hasn't been any change in terms of the reflective paint, the reflectors on crosswalks. There are no bike lanes in much of this town. So I just, quite frankly, need to know that the city accommodates and thinks about the worst case scenario as it relates to the pedestrians and the taxpayers that live in this town. So again, I think that I speak for much of the city that they would want to make sure that as we address speed limits, that pedestrian safety is part of this discussion. And I don't see it a part of the data that was presented at all, in my opinion. And maybe Vin or some of the other city staff can respond to that. And as the junior engineer also presented at the city council meeting a few weeks ago or a few months ago, there was considerable outrage about raising the speed limit in some of those sections. There was an article in the West Sacramento News-Ledger about it. So to my last question, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ben, I think you were gonna say something.
Right, yeah, thank you for sharing your concern. I am concerned as well, and thank you, Robbie, for clarifying. I have Lieutenant Winger here to perhaps talk a little bit about what we can do as far as target enforcement. As far as the speed survey project goes, it is really, as Robbie pointed out, it is a data collection exercise. What Commissioner or Chair Zimmer mentioned about community planning and different things we could possibly do to change behavior, I'm a big advocate of that. Unfortunately, that's a whole different approach that really requires a coordinated effort as far as a traffic calming program, in addition to future projects that we are, that are being planned and some of which have yet to be funded. I think, through a holistic approach, we can implement that, after we validate. Really, this project is just to validate existing posted speed limits. It is never our intent to increase the speed limits. It's merely a reflection of what's happening on the ground right now. And unfortunately, for our police division, traffic division, in order to enforce, the posted speed limit has to reflect the real data. So that's really the purpose of this project. But I certainly hear you with all the other concerns, and I'm very mindful of that, which is why the intersection of 5th and F, I think less than a year and a half ago, we did not identify funding for that. But going through a data-driven process and pulling up the collision rates, we're able to warrant and basically justify data behind why we need a signalized intersection there. Now, the cost to fully signalize an intersection is not cheap. The old numbers they throw around is $250,000, but the reality is it's probably closer to $500,000 for a 2-lane intersection. And then over there, it's a little bit wider, and the traffic going up and down, north and south along 5th Street, because it is an arterial that connects to a freeway interchange, the volume's higher. So that project we are actually going through a process to try to get that implemented as quickly as possible. And I think one of the items that were brought up as far as the pedestrian crossing on Bridgeway Lakes Drive, of course, we're mindful that we need, again, this all goes back to community planning and when the Bridgeway Lakes and Bridgeway Island subdivisions were built and contemplated. We have to provide for circulation in and out of those subdivisions, right? And Southport Parkway was identified as a primary loop road or primary parkway to get traffic in and out of Southport in the Southwest Village. And to get traffic up across the Palomadussie Bridge and onto the Harbor Interchange. That being said, we are mindful that it is being used by pedestrians throughout all hours of the day. So I think the segment that was brought up is actually posted at 35. And our intent is that when we do resurface the road, unfortunately, we could not beat the weather this year. Our intent is really to enhance those crosswalks and make sure the thermoplastic striping and the reflective signage, and even I think the city manager's office even brought up a letter written by some Girl Scouts where we intend to enhance a crossing over there in that same vicinity to make it safer for pedestrians who cross back and forth. It is our intention to get those done, to get those projects implemented outside of this, this data heavy exercise.
Well, thank you for that. I think the community would really appreciate an update on that because from this data, although I think there's value and obviously there was science behind it, it won't make the city residents feel any safer to not address the speed when the pedestrian infrastructure is not addressed at the same time, in my opinion. That's all for my questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Johnston. Okay, Commissioner Hastain looks like he's ready to ask a question.
Yeah, just one point of clarification for Mr. K there. You're saying that the data that we've collected combined with California state law makes it easier for someone who was pulled over in one of these areas for speeding, easier for them to challenge in court and possibly get away with it because the data that we've collected would say that the posted speed as it currently stands is too low?
I'll let Lieutenant Winger speak to that, but basically all the posted speed limits, keep in mind the speed limit is at the high end, right? The posted speed limit needs to be supported by an EMTS study. Okay. So that's, and I think Lieutenant Winger can probably speak to some of his experiences in court.
Good evening, commissioners. Jason Winger from the police department. I'm the manager over traffic, our traffic unit. So in order for us to enforce speed through radar or LiDAR, we have to have valid speed surveys. Otherwise, we can't cite using those tools. And that's our primary method of speed enforcement in order to change driving behavior as it pertains to speed. There are still ways that we can do speed enforcement through pacing of vehicles, but it's very challenging, especially in residential neighborhoods, to be able to have the distances needed for pacing. So it is very critical for us to have approved speed surveys to allow us to utilize our tools for speed enforcement. And yeah, we could not go to court and actually be able to testify that we issued a citation without a valid speed survey.
Right, that was the main reason that Joanna touched on, why we split the data collection and certification of the speed surveys into two groups. We needed to prioritize in order to support, some of the existing segments for enforcement.
And I will add that the purpose on the law enforcement side for speed surveys is to ensure a level of oversight that law enforcement is not going out and changing speeds in certain areas to do enforcement that's considered speed traps. It's defined in the vehicle code. And therefore, in order for us to do this, it goes through this level of oversight, the data testing that's done, and then approval through council to have speed limits in place, therefore allowing us to do that. It's solely to help ensure that we don't pick an area that we want to make a target, change that speed to go become a speed trap and target speeders, and then change it back, or however it may be done if we didn't have rules in place.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Thurical.
Yeah, I just kind of share a little bit of the frustration with Commissioner Johnston. Living here on F and 7 right here, that street is really dangerous. I mean, I find myself driving on there and almost forcing myself to speed up because of the activity around me. And 5th Street alone, and I don't know how many of you have tried to cross Fifth Street, but there are so many blind spots. I mean, I have to pull my car out so far into the streets just to see if it's okay to go. And when drivers are speeding down Fifth Street, it makes it extremely difficult to navigate that area in my own home for years. And then also having there be a shrine right there on F and Fifth because of an accident that happened that cost someone their lives. And it's there always, every year. Someone rebuilds it as a reminder. And it's also a reminder for me to know I need to also drive safer in my own community. You know, I look at the data in the survey report and I keep thinking to myself, you know, I don't really like those speed increases, to say the least, right? I mean, we have a lot of issues in the area that it has to do with traffic safety. And I know that work has been done to try to address that, but at the same time, this is not a new issue, right? This has been happening for years. I mean, that's why the numbers are so big. And at the end of the day, for me, the question is, whose fault does this go to? Is this an infrastructure issue to try to find a permanent solution to the issue, or is this an issue for traffic safety and law enforcement? And for me, I see it as, you know, no offense, but you know, law enforcement hasn't really done that great of a job because, well, why? Because the accident rates are so high, right? If it was working, we wouldn't see it this high for so long. And I think a lot of the community members here want a more permanent solution to this issue, and raising the speed limit would definitely kind of, I don't know the correct term, but kind of poke the bear a little bit, right? I mean, it's kind of saying we don't really care about public safety. We're going to raise the speed limit, even though the data suggests it or recommends it, you know, without listening to, again, you know, public comment, or not public comment, but, you know, those kind of issues and for public safety. So I just feel like, you know, as Commissioner Johnson says, some things should be added into the survey to collect that data that is not so number-based, and to kind of get a more holistic view on the speed limits in the area.
Chair Zimmer, I have a question for Mr. Winger, if you don't mind.
Sure. Are there any responses, first of all, to Commissioner Therical's comments? Okay, hearing none. Go ahead, Commissioner Cianez.
Thank you. Mr. Winger, I'm assuming there's data on the number of citations issued for exceeding the posted speed limit. And I'm wondering if that data was part of this survey.
To my knowledge, that data is not part of this survey. Yes, there is data available as it pertains to citations issued.
Yeah, Officer Winger is correct, if I may add. We look at number of accidents and not necessarily number of citations issued. You know, it's not part of the data criteria. I mean, the enforceability of the speed limit is not exactly a factor that the CVC or the MUTCD has us look into as part of our consideration. So, number of citations issued does not play a factor. Recommendations for.
Yeah, I raised that question because, you know, the number of accidents or collisions, they're not always due to speeding, right? They could be other reasons, distracted driving, you know, other causes for accidents. And so just curious, you know, the posted speed limits that we have now around town, how often are drivers cited for exceeding those speed limits? And secondly, of those cited, how many are successfully prosecuted, or, you know, how many people plead guilty, and then how many people challenge them, and what do those numbers look like?
I will speak that in the current year, 2021 and 2020, are going to have data that isn't going to be very accurate, in part because of COVID. There was a period of time that in the initial time period of COVID that we were not doing any proactive enforcement in the field to minimize contact in the first few months as we figured out how to work through that. And then most recently in this last year and a half or so, we've been challenged with the speed surveys needing to be renewed and not being able to utilize speed enforcement with LiDAR or radar to impact that. So it minimizes our ability to actually use speed. Doesn't mean we can't do enforcement in certain areas, but using those tools is not an option. So we truly can't show you accurate numbers right now because it is not or has not been a normal year. I will say though that I have some numbers that we utilize the speed or the collision database, and for January from 2018 to December 31st of 2020, we had 600 injury collisions within our city. And out of those 600, 139 of the injury collisions were a primary collision factor of unsafe speed. So that comes out, I believe, to be approximately 23%. And out of 16 fatal collisions during that time period, only one of the 16 was primary collision factor of speed, unsafe speed.
So out of the 600 collisions, 23% were due to not observing the speed limit, exceeding the speed limit.
Unsafe speed was the primary collision factor, the identified violation that led to that collision.
Right. That seems really low, 23%. So speed limits. I mean, I support the recommendation of the increased speed limits. Thank you.
Chair Zimmer,
Okay, go ahead.
are we going to be voting on anything tonight or supporting, or are we just listening to the presentation?
I don't believe there's any kind of vote. This is just a discussion from this presentation.
Roger.
Any other questions or comments from the commissioners?
Commissioner Gunn has his hand raised.
Oh, Commissioner Gunn.
Yeah, good evening. I just had a couple of questions. My first question is for the consultant. Were you able to identify whether the traffic going down F Street, was it local traffic? Was it commuters? Was it people just trying to cut through and take a shortcut to avoid the other streets?
Quite frankly, we looked at the total volume of traffic. We did not get into the origin destination or the commute or the trip, what we call trip purpose of those people who are using the corridor. We looked at the total volume of daily traffic using the corridor. And that's an interesting comment, actually. So if there is a concern about people who don't belong in that corridor, like cut-through traffic or external traffic, as we call it, if they are the ones who are the ones that are known to speed, then that's something that I'm sure the city staff would can provide some insights on, or whether we need to go back and look at it. But in a typical speed survey, to answer your question, Commissioner Gunn, in a typical speed survey, we look at the total volume of traffic and the total population of speeders, in the speed sample. We do not get into the origin destination of their trips, or where they're coming from, where they're going, or what the purpose of those trips are, really.
So I guess to city staff, is that something that the city would look at after hearing the comments from the public regarding maybe looking at a study on trying to address the issues on F Street?
We have, Commissioner. Let me speak a little bit to that because of my long tenure here with the city. I actually believe that you have a I mean, this is an excellent question. It's a very valid point. I believe much of that traffic is actually driven by the fact that we have an employment center over there along the riverfront with cow stores and Department of General Services. It is really quite a dense employment center. And because F Street connects all the way through to Jefferson Boulevard, that is why we have the high volume of traffic. Also noting that, again, Fifth Street is an arterial that connects to I-80 over, just north of 15th Street there, south of Mill. Likewise, it also connects to Sacramento Avenue. And so when you have the intersection of two streets that have a higher volume of traffic, therein lies a need for a signal, which we're able to justify. Keeping in mind that we are talking about the Washington district, right? This was established, I believe, the 1850s, and we're trying to redevelop the area. We're increasing the density. We're encouraging all types of land uses, and by extension, by having more people there, more users there, all types of users. One of the things that I always try to encourage with our staff and design is that we need to design and build infrastructure for all users, meaning trucks, autos, bicyclists, pedestrians, kids walking to school, someone in a wheelchair, someone in a scooter, someone who's visually impaired. We need to design and build our infrastructure for all types of users. And to that end, I hope I can speak a little bit to some of the comments and questions that have been brought up tonight. Now, keeping in mind that with a engineering and traffic survey, we're merely, the data is just reflecting what's happening. Now, going forward into the future, with the passage AB 43 and perhaps even pulling that from outside of MUTCD, certainly as city staff and knowing how progressive the city is, we are certainly open to different ways of doing things. We believe we can make our roadways safer for all types of users, especially pedestrians and more vulnerable type users, as Ravi mentioned in that legislation. Unfortunately, with the current regulation that's currently in place, and in order to accommodate our enforcement, this is the best we can do. If there's other avenues that the city can embark on to make things safer, staff would certainly welcome it if direction comes from the council.
Thank you. And I guess my second question is, with the increase of speed limit on F Street, are there any traffic calming items that you use to, control the speed limit, with it increasing, to keep, people from driving faster on it? Because, now, okay, speed limit is up to 35. Okay, great. Now I can drive even faster, right? So are there traffic calming items that could be used to try to control the speed limit with the increase going into effect?
Certainly. I am all for traffic calming. One of I think the project you should look to, I encourage everyone to look at, hopefully by the end of the month and in early December, is what we're able to do with the West Scapolo Avenue project and that entire corridor from Jefferson Boulevard all the way to our trail connector near Enterprise, where it connects to that bike trail across the causeway. We distinctly try to delineate the segments very differently, knowing that from Jefferson to West Acre, it is a central business district. And then from West Acre to about, got the name, Pecan or Glide, there's a residential district there where we have a lot of uncontrolled crossing for pedestrians. From Glide to Jefferson, we purposely try to narrow the travel lanes for autos. And then we pull the bikers and the bike lanes away from some of these right turn hooks, collisions with bicyclists, knowing that's a heavily used commute corridor for cyclists. But beyond that, further to the west, we are aware that from Harbor onward, it is part of a truck route. So therefore, we can't narrow the lanes too much, or it will provide a conflict, for the larger vehicles. But by the same token, we are adding quite a bit of quite a few streetlights, over 100 in fact, and highlighting where the bicycles are supposed to be. And hopefully we have made that corridor a lot safer. I think what we will try to do in the future, if we're able to get funded, is when we resurface and preserve our existing roadways, we should really embark on narrowing our streets. Not necessarily reducing the width of the street itself, because what's built is built, right? What we can do is delineate it so that it is, the delineated area is not too wide. So by narrowing the lane to 11 foot, and if we change our standards to 11-foot travel lanes for all the roadways that are not anticipated to be truck routes, I think we can effectively reduce and calm, indirectly. It is actually the best method of traffic calming if you can psychologically fool the drivers into compliance. Now, other things that really help with traffic calming is adjacent buildings, adjacent landscaping. When you're driving along a corridor and there's trees passing by, right? There's trees passing by, or there's a high-rise building next to you, you're not going to be speeding, right? Now, unfortunately, for so many segments where we have a lot of speeding issues, like South Park Parkway or Village Parkway, the roadways are built. There's nothing adjacent to it. It's just vacant, undeveloped land. Therefore, you have speeding issues. We can try to calm that down, with delineation where possible, but to some extent, that's about all we can do until the development comes along with it. If you drive around, you'll notice the segments are built out when there are especially multi-story buildings next to it, and the roadway isn't excessively wide, you don't have speeding issues. It's just when the roadway is excessively wide and there's nothing next to it, nothing adjacent to the roadway, you're going to have speeding issues.
And then regarding F and Fifth, is that project in planning, or is it has it made it to design phase, or regarding signalization?
We are actually in the environmental phase. We are funded for it. Our intent is to get a designer on ASAP. Unfortunately, it is a very challenging location. The Washington district, again, is very old. We have to accommodate a lot of cultural resources and a lot of environmental activities that we have to prepare ahead of time before we actually initiate the design. So without getting into too much detail, that's typically what you have to do in a historic area.
Mm-hmm. Is there an estimated completion year or date?
Our goal is to get a designer on board next year, and I would anticipate design to take about next year, and then bid and construct in 2023.
Okay, sounds good. And
it's
then
close.
And then I guess one final question. It's just a general question. Does the city council have the ability to reject portions of the speed survey, saying like, okay, we're okay with like Del Monte going up to 35, but we're not okay with, let's just say Marshall increasing? Do they have the ability to reject part of it, all of it, pieces of it?
Yeah, absolutely. If a segment does not get certified, we just can't post that segment.
Mm-hmm.
As as mentioned in Joanna's presentation, there are segments that we're not surveying right now, like West Capitol Avenue, because we know it's under construction. Likewise for Fifth Street and South River Road. When that project is built, hopefully, later next year, we're going to resurvey those. So there's always an opportunity to do the improvements first, perform the traffic calming, and then resurvey. So it's a combination of both. We can certify the current results, update the posting, and then we can resurvey again after we make the changes.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, are there additional questions or comments? I don't see any, but I have a couple myself. I want to say thank you to everybody who's given a presentation today and answered questions, because I think this is a very tricky issue. My understanding of the situation is that the city's hands are tied, that once you do this survey, you have to change the speed limits to be in compliance. And I find that really frustrating, actually. And I do have one quick question regarding the California Vehicular Code and the sort of situation with Cummins having a prima facie speed limit set. I don't know. I don't entirely understand why that's not an option for Fifth Street, because it does seem like it's a high density residential area and that most of the city meets that standard. I was trying to read through the statutes, and it seemed like, yes, there were things about schools and senior centers, but it was also sort of the default. Is there a reason why that's not possible? Is it because we've already done the study? Is that the issue?
Chair Zimmer, is the question about Fifth Street or F Street? Just I'm trying to understand.
Let's say F Street for now, but
F Street,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, that's a consideration we should definitely go back. If typically, if you're using the Cummins Way example, we clearly have residential driveways and fronting the road. And there's a density criteria of 16 dwelling units over a half a mile frontage of the road, counting both sides of the road, that qualifies it as a residential fronting street. Again, I'm quoting the CVC guidance off the top of my head on those definitions. And then the street width shall not exceed 40 feet. And I do not know off the top of my head if F Street meets those criteria. But we could definitely go back and look at it. That could be a potential consideration for retaining 25 miles per hour. But something that I'm happy to go back and look at and see if it meets the criteria.
F Street it's a 2-lane road. I don't know if it meets the residential density criteria now, but I would be surprised if it didn't, honestly. And then the other question is, it depends on where, I guess, on F Street. And the other question is 40 feet road width. There are 2 bike lanes that are 4 feet wide on F Street. Would that count against or for the width? Like, would you have, to me, that's not street width.
The total width is the traveled curb to curb width. It does not necessarily distinguish between vehicular lanes and bike lanes. Yeah. So the total vehicular traveled way is how it's defined, and it has to be 40 foot or less for it to be considered a local street. Otherwise, it's technically not considered a local street. I'm talking off the top of my head here again. We had the similar issue on Park Boulevard between Stone Boulevard and Jefferson. That corridor meets the residential density criteria, but does not meet the street width criteria because there's a 2-way left turn median lane and on-street parking. So clearly that street was way wider than 40 foot. So we could not apply the prima facie 25 mile per hour speed limit for that street, given our current status quo. But F Street is something that I will have to go back and check. But that's a good question, though.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was curious about that. It may be too wide because of the bike lanes. I'm not entirely sure if it meets that criteria or not, but I think it's, considering the accident rate and the high level of concerns, it may be worth a look. And I'm encouraged to hear that AB 43 will be coming into play in 3 years, which I think gives the city a little bit more flexibility with its speed limits. And so that's good. So even if we have to raise these speed limits now, maybe in 3 years, if it's still a huge concern, we can drop them. I'm also encouraged that the city is looking at infrastructure. As Mr. K pointed out, cars drive based on what they're responding to their environment, right? They're responding to their lane width and the presence of trees and the presence of buildings. And so, yeah, I think a lot of us are frustrated with this idea that speed limits are a function of how fast the cars are driving and not a function of planning. And I understand the reasons behind it. And I think but I think that is the source of a lot of our frustration here. And I guess I like the idea that there are some ideas about how to calm the traffic in terms of making the lanes a little bit narrower and continuing to build infrastructure. I did have a question and I just lost my train of thought. I was curious so F Street, regarding who is driving up and down F Street, I don't know. I will share this anecdote though. I live in Bright and I was heading to downtown and I, for some reason, had Google Maps up and it directed me to go down F Street. And that is not the route I would have normally chosen, just based on where I think the arterials are. I think I would have chosen either Sacramento or West Cap. So the city may have an issue with Google Maps directing traffic down F Street. And that may be contributing to higher speeds. And it may also be contributing to unfamiliarity with those intersections. It sounds like there's a lot of broadside intersection collisions at 5th Street. And if somebody is kind of in a rush to get downtown, they may not realize that there was a stop sign or something there. So I guess I just kind of want to flag that there may be an issue with how the maps are directing people, and the city might want to consider whether or not we want through traffic going down F Street or not, whether we would prefer to somehow make that harder, whether that's blocking it off or limiting it to local traffic or emergency vehicles only. I don't know. I know the city of Sacramento has some streets where they've intentionally made it very difficult to go through. So just going to flag that as potential solution there. I don't know if any of the other folks here have had that same impression. Yeah.
I will say that is a very broad issue, not just in our community, but state and nationwide. Talking with our law enforcement agencies, where the apps on phones are rerouting traffic and impact, residential traffic issues. We've seen that on other thoroughfares within the city. That the only thing that we can figure is that is, whether it's Waze or the different map apps that are rerouting people down those streets to avoid stoppages at stoplights or other intersections. And it's going to be a challenge moving forward in the future with the city like ours, where we have such an industrial backbone here and businesses, a lot of people coming into our community throughout the day and night to do business and leave, and they're relying on those apps to help get them to and from those locations.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Therikel, did you have a follow-up question or comment?
No, I just want to, you kind of already touched on it. I was just about to lower the hand. But yeah, the F Street area, it's not just residential. There's a lot of trucks in the area, like a massive amount of trucks in the area. And so increasing the speed limit of just kind of what you were saying, and with those trucks in the area.
Yeah, I wonder if it's possible to have a simple solution, like one of those flashy, you're going 30 miles an hour and it flashes at you and you're supposed to be going 25, could be a sort of a Band-Aid solution to that area. I don't know if the city has those available or if they're in short supply, but that's the sort of thing that might get people to slow down a little bit. Yeah. Yeah,
I'll touch on that real quick. Those are called radar speed feedback signs. We actually implemented a couple of those. I think one on Village Parkway over by the condos to allow kids to cross the street over there on Village Parkway. They work to some extent, but in reality, I think in the future, we just need to be more mindful when we plan and lay out our street system. We need to make our roadways not so wide and unfairly burden our pedestrians, having to cross 4 lanes to get point A to point B. If it's not necessary, especially if it's not needed for the volume traffic going through there. So I think there's many areas throughout the city where, you could say that some of those turn pockets are way too long. Some of the roadways don't need to be 12 feet wide. Some of those intersections a lot wider than it needs to be. I can give you one prime example, but again, it may not be anybody's fault. It may be, circumstances due to planning that has changed, right? Take Jefferson and Lake Washington, for example. At one time, we anticipated 6 lanes on Lake Washington from Jefferson across the river, right? If we were to have a bridge across the river to I-5, that's no longer the case. So going forward, we should be looking at how we can possibly redesign the intersection to make it, more appealing for users that are not just autos, cars.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This has been very informative and interesting, and I think there's a lot of forward thinking, and hopefully some of these issues can be addressed in the future, and maybe changes in the California Vehicular Code will make it a little easier for the city to address these issues as well. Are there any final comments from anybody? Commissioners? Okay, seeing none, we do have one more item on the agenda. So I'm going to propose that we move on. We have agenda item 4, presentation and discussion of the city's climate action plan update. I believe we're going to receive a presentation from staff, but there will be no vote on this either. So staff, would you like to take over for agenda item 4?
Yes, thank you, Chair Zimmer. My name is David Tilley. I'm the principal planner in the city's community development department, and I am leading our climate action planning work. So given the density of our previous item, we're going to try to expedite our presentation tonight on what is obviously a very, very front and center topic across the board. So Ben, if you could throw the PowerPoint up, please. Thank you. And we've already dispensed with that slide. I'll be doing an introduction here about where we have been to date, and then Seamus Laffey on my staff is going to take you through where we think we ought to go. So Ben, go ahead, next slide, please. So this is in one slide to date. This is a summary of the last almost 15 years of where we have been on climate change and our climate action planning in our city. We did a draft cap way back in 2009 when caps were in their infancy, and we were really learning as we went at that point in time. And so that was sort of our basis for it. That needed environmental review, which was tied to the general plan. During those recessionary years, a lot of that work kind of needed to be paused due to fiscal constraints. So fast forward to starting getting into 2018, 2019. Our city participated in the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change. That's Mayor's plural, because it was our city and the city of Sacramento who over 18 months put together a very lengthy and involved effort on climate change matters related to both cities. On the very first meeting of that commission, which I was the primary staff person on, in West Sacramento, was represented by Councilman Chris Ledesma. The statement, and I put it in quotes because there's a direct quote from then Mayor Cabaldon and current Mayor Steinberg in Sacramento, to be bold and aggressive. And our participation in that effort was meant to inform our own climate action planning work, which was going on at the same time, although very much in the beginning of it. The Mayor's Commission on Climate Change formed these technical advisory committees that looked at various sectors. There was one for the built environment. There was one for mobility. There was one for equity. There was other ones, all focused in different sectors, and all eventually came together into the Mayor's Commission final report, which was completed last summer, and then we presented that to the City Council late last fall, and that's really forming the basis of our work, which we then need to take that information and those objectives, some of which I believe was really germane to your previous item, and now we have to drill it down to our city level and what we're able to do here in the real world. So it was a great basis for it. The outreach on that effort was amazing. And to me, the most important part that emerged from it was the need to really address equity matters in climate action planning, because the two are completely intertwined, especially in a community like ours here in West Sacramento. So, next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Seamus now. He's going to walk you through kind of where we are going, but all along the way, we can take questions along the way or at the end. But we are going to try to move this to get to the most important parts for you, because we are really seeking your feedback on some topics. So, Seamus?
Yes. So the overall goal of the Climate Action Plan is to get to net zero emissions by 2045. So this is when the net greenhouse gas emissions in the city equals zero. So this is it's coming up, less than 25 years from now. So to start off with Climate Action Plan, our consultant AECOM did a greenhouse gas inventory to see where we are. So you can see on the slide here that 64% of the city's emissions come from transportation. So this could be personal automobile, truck traffic from all the warehousing we have in the city, or other industrial uses. 30% comes from building energy, so energy used to heat and cool buildings. And then 6% comes from waste. So then next slide. So this further breaks it down. And what we're going to go over tonight is specific to the transportation related. So you can see that 58% of the city's greenhouse gas inventory comes from on-road vehicles. This is a real opportunity here for where we can reduce emissions the most, and that will be from transportation. So next slide, Ben. So there are 6 overarching goals in the Climate Action Plan, and this is still draft, so we're taking public comment. And 2 of them are transportation related, but I'll go through all 6 here real quickly. So the first one is planned for all electric buildings citywide. So no more natural gas. We really need to be all electric and have that electricity come from renewable sources. So the next goal is design a future with zero carbon power sources. Ties back into the first one. The third one here, reimagine how we move people and goods. And then the fourth one, promote cleaner vehicles and equipment in our community. So these 2, the third and fourth one here, really are what we're seeking input from this commission tonight. And then the next one is create a waste-free city, and then build carbon-negative livable communities. So for each emission reduction strategy, there are multiple example actions the city can take, and there will be implementation measures, and we'll have equity in mind as well. That's going to be at the forefront. A lot of the impacts of climate change will be really the people in disadvantaged communities are really going to feel the brunt of it. If you can't afford to put in an air filter for all the smoke we're getting, stuff like, or you can't afford to, cool your house down in the middle of summer. So equity is definitely an important lens that we're looking through. So next slide, Ben. So the first goal that we're looking for input from the Transportation and Mobility Commission tonight is reimagining how we move people and goods. So a lot of these are already doing as a city. We really just need to double down. So prioritizing transit-oriented development and center corridor community growth through land use planning. So this is one where we already, we're doing this already, but we really got to double down. The next one is funding to expand active transportation and micro mobility network. The third one is develop partnerships and allocate funding to increase the accessibility, frequency, and reliability of public transit. The next one is provide more telecommuting opportunities. And lastly, advocate for use of alternative fuels within the rail freight system. So really trying to get people to use alternative transit modes. No more personal automobile if you don't need to. And then next slide, Ben. So the next goal that's transportation related is promote cleaner vehicles and equipment in our community. So if you can't take alternative modes of transportation, take a vehicle that is clean. So establish the first action under that goal is establishing EV car share program with free or subsidized rates for low income residents, really trying to encourage more EV cars in the city. The next one is establishing vehicle electrification targets for city vehicles. Expand the EV charging network through zoning code requirements and installations of public charging infrastructure. So for background, the city already in new development requires that 20% of spaces be EV. And the California Building Code only requires 6%. So we're already above what's required. But really, we need to, by 2045, we got to be pretty much all EV or some other alternative, clean energy source. So the next one here is partner with warehouse and distribution centers to facilitate fleet electrification. I know a few of our larger warehouses are already looking at that. I know Amazon's looking to transition their fleet to EVs, and their new distribution center in Southport is set up for that, to transition over to EVs in the near future. And the last one here is promote off-road vehicle electrification by specifying low or zero emission vehicles in city contracts. By off-road, I mean, you might think off-road vehicles, but this is really more like forklifts, stuff like that. So vehicles that might be not on our city roads, but they're still vehicles and promoting, emitting greenhouse gas emissions. So those two goals we're looking for input tonight. And if you can think of any other goals or actions that we have not thought of, this is a draft. So we will have a full draft climate action plan, hopefully pretty soon. We'll have a full draft of the recommended GHG reduction strategies on the city's website. We have a climate action page. So this concludes my overview of the draft GHG reduction measures that are transportation related. I think we can open up the Q&A right now unless Mr. Tilley has anything to add.
Yeah, to tie this all back to the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change and to provide some context, one of the primary recommendations out of the Mayor's Commission final report was to get us to about 30% of all trips by active transportation. So that's biking, walking, scooting, rolling, buses, any other form of transportation other than a single occupancy vehicle. Right now, I'd venture to say that particular proportion of the mode share is maybe about 1%. So we're talking about whole-scale changes in how people live, without a doubt. If we are going to get our climate change goals achieved, and climate change is already happening, and as evidenced by some of what's coming out of Glasgow today, this is serious, and we need to address it. And we're wanting to come to your commission tonight on the transportation side because of over half of our emissions come from this particular sector. So in our estimation, if we don't, this is where we need to make the hugest gain, because it's where the over half the emissions are coming from. So Ben, can you move to the next couple of slides, please? So wanted to look at this slide here because part of what we're trying to do with our climate action plan is not just tell people what we want to do, but what would it accomplish, and what would it mean to the individual. We need maximum community buy-in on these various measures if we're going to achieve our goals and try to avoid the worst possible effects of climate change in our community and in the surrounding region. So we're trying to set this document up as user-friendly as possible and to help people understand what doing some of these things may mean for them, and in particular how it can benefit them. And so clearly walking and biking is good from a public health standpoint. It's also good from a social cohesion standpoint. And so anything that may have co-benefits is one of things we think may stand the best chance of achieving. Same thing with removing tailpipe emissions is good for air quality. Yeah, that's also good for public health. So there's a lot here, and it's a lot to take down. But in reality, we're focusing, as much as we're looking at solar and many other applications, transportation is our biggest part of this that we have to really attack, because we have such a large source of emissions that are coming from tailpipes. So Ben, can you move to the next slide, please? Next one more, please. So here's an example action that we have in our draft cap now. And these are some things maybe you may be familiar with and we're already doing, but it's clear we need to do more. And I think a lot of this has, tied into your previous item about making sure that roadways and other facilities are set up well for all modes. We do have complete streets policies in the general plan where we will need to retrofit existing streets to make sure they include bikeways, sidewalks, etc. But we may need to do many of the other things that Mr. K in the previous item suggested as well, like lane narrowing and better, signage, lighting, etc. And so these are things that all have multi-benefits because walking and biking are good. And the best way we can do to help some of the speeding is hopefully reduce the overall number of people that are actually driving on the roads, introduce more friction with bicycles, pedestrian activity, micromobility options. So we want to prompt you with a couple of questions here. So we'll move on to the next slide, please, Ben. So now we want to weave in a little bit of the equity consideration. Equity is a serious concern in our community, as it is in many other communities, and we are working on what can we do about that. And there's no way to do climate without doing equity. So we're already experiencing in our community where we do have a higher disproportionate amount of lower income residents and fatalities with vehicles and collisions. So part of how we can hopefully accomplish multiple goals at once will be to prioritize various improvements in our disadvantaged neighborhoods to help those individuals in their day-to-day lives, but in the bigger picture, facilitate biking and walking more to help reduce emissions, in their totality. So Ben, next slide, please. So this is a time where we'd like to prompt the commission with a few questions and receive some of your feedback. This is really related to that particular action and as it may relate back to equity. So if our goal is to really expand active transportation and our mobility options in our community, if the commission has any other thoughts about additional equity solutions related to this, those are kinds of things we'd like to hear about. If not tonight, we can always, send some stuff to Jason, which he can relay to us, offline. But we really want to get some good input in on this equity question. So at this point, I'd like to pause and turn it back to the commission for any input at this stage.
Commissioners, any comments, questions? Well, I have a quick question. This might be off in left field a little bit, but there's some communities, retirement communities in particular in the South, where everybody drives these road legal golf carts around. And I just wonder if something like that would be, a way of addressing equity. Maybe we allow them to use some of the bike paths, or the bike paths are a little wider. Maybe we have some streets where we prevent cars from driving through, so it's really inconvenient to drive if you're going 6 blocks to church or whatever it is. But if there's a little electric golf cart all over the place, and those are allowed to go through, but the cars are not, that sort of thing could be useful. It also allows folks who maybe aren't going to ride a bike because they're older, but maybe they would be happy to hop in a little golf cart and drive around, and that would be better than driving a car. I don't know. I don't know if there's any sort of alternative networks that are thinking beyond bicycles.
Well, you're right. Those are generally referred to as NEVs, neighborhood level electric vehicles. I wish some of our staff from the previous item was still on the call to help respond to that. But those are ones we have explored, and it goes back to your previous item about speed limits. Most of those are rated for streets at 25 miles an hour or less. And so you can do that in your neighborhood, but as soon as you approach a collector where the speed limits may be up to 35, then they're no good. But also the converse of that is putting them on some of the bike paths. They're frankly too fast. Areas where there's pedestrian activity, equestrian activity, things like that. But that's the type of thing that we ought to be not closing the door on either, because I think you make a good point about that from an equity standpoint as well as a reducing emissions standpoint. So we will look further into the notion of how can we accommodate NEVs in our community, because I think there is a role for those, and they could replace potentially a lot of car trips, especially in some of our more mixed-use neighborhoods where people don't need to drive miles and miles and miles to go to the grocery store.
David, this is Jason McCoy. If I could jump in here, I used to work for a number of architecture and engineering firms, including our own design group that helped design out some of the neighborhood electric vehicle developments in Roseville, Rockland area. There are a couple out there. Mostly this needs to be designed from the ground up. So when you are putting in that infrastructure to start, I know there were a lot of comments on infrastructure and the ability to do traffic calming or whatnot on some of the existing infrastructure. When you're dealing with a historic area or a place that has already built out, you're extremely limited on what you're able to accomplish with something as dominant as an NEV plan can be for infrastructure needs. So you're talking about 12-foot travel ways, that would require eliminating an entire vehicle lane. If you're talking about a network that only has 2 lanes, you're automatically not able to do that. Where we do have opportunities to do that would be more in the Southport area with some of the communities, such as if Yarborough were to come online, for instance, and decide that they wanted to redesign the community, then that could be a possibility. So these are things that could be considered with future development, but it would require a way of wholesale relooking at a development to accomplish that from the ground up.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. One of the cities that I do actually really like biking around is Davis, and it's because there's the Davis Greenway, which goes behind houses, and I wish more developments were required to interconnect greenways in the future, and maybe they will be. But yeah, you're right. That's a ground up thing. Commissioner Gunn, I think you have a comment as well.
Yes, I just have a couple questions. I noticed one of the goals was talking about increasing the frequency of public transportation. However, a couple of months ago, we had a presentation from Yolo Bus where they're actually talking about cutting the frequency of transportation. So I was just kind of wondering, what's the thought about, the goal is to increase, but in reality, we're actually decreasing public transportation.
Well, I think we want to think about public transportation and perhaps in a broader sense than just what we have always known it to be. This could be a form of more neighborhood shuttle level things rather than, big empty buses that are very expensive to operate, purchase, operate, and maintain. We were working hard to get light rail to come into West Sacramento, as I'm sure your commission knows. So there's a lot of options there out there beyond traditional fixed route bus service. So this is really time to be outside the box. And so there's a lot of other options out there, and there may be things that come. There's still the autonomous vehicles that are still premise of them, especially shuttles. But the best way we can make the transportation work is do better on the land use side of it. So people that have done what I do for a living for decades have made things much, much harder for people like Jason to do. So we're trying to marry that, and that's a big reason why Jason's group is in community development now, and he and I are working shoulder to shoulder on these matters. But I'm certainly aware of the acute issues that we have with Yolo Bus, at the moment. But this is an example of how we need a real paradigm shift, and we need to emphasize the transit and the NEV and the bicycle and the pedestrian, and de-emphasize the vehicle, especially the single occupant vehicle. It's going to be a tough pill to swallow, but I firmly believe that the worst of climate change will be even worse pill to swallow. We're already experiencing it now, and this goes to equity as well. We need to provide people more mobility options to help them get to where they need to be.
Yeah. And then just a second question, just kind of in general. I noticed the goal is to have like an all-electric city fleet. And I was just wondering, in future city contracts, whether it's with consultants like AECOM or Moss McDonald, or with landscaping service, is there any thought process about adding language to requiring those vehicles to have maybe X amount of vehicles being all electric or anything like that?
In my view, that's wholly within our power to do. And this won't be just us doing that, so that those companies that provide those services, can justify those investments, because other communities, will be looking for it as well. So, we're wholly within the capability to do that, and the technology exists. It may be more expensive in the short term, but the long-term benefits, I would hope, would more than justify those costs. But we got to get started somewhere, and that's a great place to get started. I was thinking about that, when I see the lawnmowers driving around my kids' school in the morning, spewing out all their emissions, right into the kids who are playing there. I think we could do that better. And, that's a school district thing, but, the same thing goes for city parks and other facilities.
My questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Thuricle.
I have two things. I think one, this is a huge infrastructure need. So in the area that I live in, it's just 2 blocks away from 5th Street. And it just so happens that the closest bus stop for my community to use is on 5th Street. And there are no sidewalks that lead up to that street. So people are actually walking on the street to get there. I know, because I used to be one of them having to do it. And so that's a huge issue.
We're working on that right now. We've got a couple of blocks of sidewalk gap to close on E and F streets, and we're working on and designing that as we speak.
And then, in addition to that, I know there's been work on 5th Street done at the intersections, and it's actually just honestly very confusing because it looks underdeveloped. It's not finished yet, and I assume that it's not finished yet because it looks like a 4-way stop, but it's not. And so that could be kind of confusing to drivers and to pedestrians who are trying to use that crossway to get to the bus stops or coming home from a bus stop. So I just wanted to point that out.
If I could speak to that, there are signs posted at that intersection that says cross traffic does not stop. So the crosswalks that are in there are designed to highlight pedestrians who are already crossing in those locations in order to make drivers aware of that. If it looks like a 4-way stop, then that is driver error, because we do have signs up there and advising when cross traffic is going to be there. So those are legal intersections. They are completed.
I guess from my perspective, it doesn't I don't think I've ever seen that sign, but I will definitely look out for that one. It could be maybe confusing to the driver to read, but thank you for that. I'll definitely keep an eye out for that sign. The other thing I wanted to ask was, how does Uber and Lyft kind of fall into this equation of trying to, lower transportation? I mean, it seems like that's going to be a continuing thing. It's not like we could just block them out of our city, although I think some cities or communities in California have actually blocked Uber or Lyft out from the service in the area. So I'm just curious how that's going to work.
And most data out there would suggest that Uber and Lyft are actually increasing VMT rather than decreasing VMT. But where I think services like the existence of Uber and Lyft, and then via things like that, in my view, that makes it more feasible for someone to be carless because they have these options to get to where they need to go when they need to go there. Well, if you own your own vehicle, 90% of the time it's probably just parked somewhere. But it's just knowing that it's there that gives you some sense that, hey, I can go to wherever I need to go whenever I need to go there. So I think there is a role for rideshare services and car sharing services, especially as we're moving away from parking minimums in most of our development, especially in the urban areas, and we're providing more opportunities for car share, bike share. I like to think that if somebody were chose to go carless or was carless out of necessity economically, that those services would still help people get around, to where they need to be. So there is a role there, but by no means is Uber and Lyft a panacea from a VMT standpoint. But if they allow people to go car free, then I think they have a piece of this part of the solution here.
Thank you for that.
If there are any other questions on this item, Seamus, you want to move on to sort of our next one? We can. Ben, go ahead and move on to the next one, please.
Yeah, so example action number 2, Ben. So this is another example action. There are about 10 or so actions that fall within under the 2 transportation related goals. So we have these as examples. But example action number 2 is partner with warehouse and distribution centers to facilitate fleet electrification. So we would identify areas where the city can provide charging infrastructure in public spaces near warehouses or take other supportive action. So Ben, next slide. So for each action, we're identifying equity issues and also equity solutions. So a potential issue with this action that we've identified is that providing fleet charging stations and warehousing distribution areas would maintain the current truck traffic impacts in these neighborhoods. And a potential equity solution is to ensure that strategic placement of charging areas to reduce truck traffic impact on marginalized communities. And then fleet electrification can decrease local pollutants for residents and workers. So for each action, we've identified equity issues and potential solutions. And then Ben, next slide. So some questions for the commission. What are other equity issues from this action that we should consider? And what are other equity solutions for this action that we should consider? And how can we ensure that the benefits of this action are equitably distributed? So we'll go back to these questions right here. Ben, can you go to the next slide real quick? Because we also have implementation tactics for each action. So for the implementation tactics for this action is exploring pooling procurement for bulk EV purchases to get warehousing and distribution centers to electrify their fleet. And then also aligning with CARB with their 2025 transportation refrigeration unit emission regulations. And then also utilizing utility rebate programs such as PG&E's EV fleet program. So we've got these equity issues and solutions implementation tactics identified for each action. And we'll have a draft of that on the city website here shortly. So that way, any members of the public or commissioners can go in and look at that and provide public feedback. So Ben, can you go back to the previous slides? We can open it back up for discussion. So yeah, here are the three questions that we have for the commission, or if you have questions or on any of the other items that have been brought up tonight.
Chair Zimmer, I have a question.
Go for it, Commissioner Stianos.
So when you talk about equity and the impact on marginalized communities in these neighborhoods, how are you defining those marginalized communities in these neighborhoods? And where are they in West Sacramento?
I'll respond to that, Commissioner. The typical methodology is looking at coronavirus screen, and which accounts for numerous factors. We definitely have disadvantaged communities by that metric in our community, particularly the northwest part of our city, the Park Boulevard area on the west side of Park Boulevard, some of the areas along the south side of West Capitol. And all of these are not surprised in this sense, given their adjacency to rail lines, freeways, legacy industrial uses, things that have all been out there for a long time. So this is an opportunity to us. This is an opportunity for one of those co-benefits, to where not only can we reduce emissions, but hopefully this can move the needle somewhat in the right direction in some of these neighborhoods, to correct some of these historic inequities, or what was once called environmental justice matters. So this is an opportunity for a win on the localized level, but also in the bigger sense of reducing emissions, because we're not just talking about emissions that cause climate change. These are also emissions that contribute to air quality issues, public health concerns, things like that.
So the CalEnviro screen, I think, is a great tool, an accurate tool. But do we have that mapped for West Sacramento? Do we have a map of West Sacramento, and then the areas that are identified as disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, no, we have that. That's all public information. Anybody can go on OEHA's website. I don't have it here in front of us tonight, but that's all information that anybody can gather at any time.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful for the commissioners to see and have, to help inform this discussion. I know it would be helpful for me.
We can provide that information via Jason to the commission.
Okay, because I mean, generally I have an idea of where the disadvantaged communities are in West Sacramento, but to have a map with accurate boundaries and mapping, I think would be helpful. Thank you.
Hi, this is Jason. There's, through CalEnviro screen, both through the AB 1550 legislation, SB, was it 535, identifies what low-income communities are and what disadvantaged communities are, and they are actively posted on the website, and they are updated regularly. So for any grant that we apply for as the city, we don't just have a map, because it is continuously updated. So we always go back and refer to the source at CalEnviro screen and put the most recent printouts that we submit along with those grants to ensure that we have the updated information. But what I'm going to do right now is type in that website into this webinar so that you guys can access that after this meeting.
Now, is there there's a distinction between low-income community and disadvantaged community in the map?
I'll have to take a look and see. You can play with the different tools to identify them, but the definitions are provided through the legislation, the 1550 and 535.
And so as it relates to equity issues for this plan that we're talking about, are we talking about disadvantage or low income, or are we talking about both?
David, I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, disadvantaged communities really is the term of art, and there's a clear relationship there between income levels. But the Cal virus screen factors in a lot. It brings in all kinds of different factors, and it was originally created with pollutant exposures, type information, public health considerations, things of that nature. So I prefer that we try to use the same terminology as use the term disadvantage. That's the term of art in Cal virus screen.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gunn?
Yes, I just had a quick question. I know for the industrial equipment, a lot of the topics have been like on electrified, like forklifts, man lifts or whatnot. Has there been conversations about other forms of clean energy, perhaps hydrogen? I know there are definitely hydrogen fueled forklifts out there, which could definitely save overhead because you don't need additional charging stations. Just simply having a provider change out the hydrogen fuel tanks, which could maybe save overhead on for instead of installing electric charging ports for the different vehicles.
Hydrogen is absolutely an option, and that would be part of the equation too. What we're looking for is zero emission sources. So whatever that comes from and whatever may be invented in the future. Pretty cool that West Sacramento had the first retail hydrogen fueling station in the entire state. And we have someone looking at doing another one here in our community, one that would be perhaps a lot more accessible to some of the industrial base that we have in our community. So yes, hydrogen will absolutely be part of this. And I would see the electric is really being a bridge to that. But we really need hydrogen so that we can hopefully get a little more energy independence and not be dependent upon our current energy provider that admittedly, we do struggle with somewhat on some of these matters.
And I'm just curious, what is the response in areas where, bordering underserved like companies? Because, for a smaller company, Amazon, they have $1 billion company that can afford electric vehicle. If we're talking about mom and pop companies, changing their fleet even over time from, say, a diesel forklift or whatever to electrified hydrogen is definitely costly. So what is kind of the response?
Well, that's an equity consideration as well. And one of the things that I'm excited about, us rolling out and want Jason to provide the details is some of the public charging infrastructure that we want to deploy around town, especially the kind that may be available to fleet vehicles, so that at least we could help those smaller businesses by providing charging infrastructure for them so that they don't have to do that part on their own. They may need to get the vehicle, and these are things that need to be significantly incentivized. And this was a big part of the Mayor's Commission on climate change work, where we did need to remind our partners in Sacramento who are on SMUD how it is definitely a different world over here in Yolo County being on PG&E. And the incentives that, quite frankly, the incentives that SMUD offers to residential and commercial customers are significantly more robust than what PG&E has to offer at the moment. So that's why that was a big plank in that final report to advocate for West Sacramento to move to a much more climate-friendly utility. Because we need that type of incentive, especially to help those smaller businesses that you mentioned. That for every Amazon, there's a zillion small businesses, and those small businesses matter. We want them to continue, but we recognize that they may need more help than your Fortune 500 type companies.
Mm-hmm.
Jason, do we have any ETA on some of that charging infrastructure that we got the SACOG grant for?
Sure. We're actually kicking that process off now, and we're actually working with some partners that SMUD is working with on their freight electrification side. So as of now, our main focus is the design of electric vehicle charging infrastructure on city property. That's the low-hanging fruit because it does not require outside partners. It does not require acquisition of property. So once we get through that, we're also going to be working on teaming with other partners to put electric vehicle charging infrastructure on private property or district property. And then we'll also talk with some of our business community about the benefits of electrification.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I just have a quick comment. Like I'm sort of struggling to figure out how we would partner with warehouses and whatnot. But I think the idea of putting in charging infrastructure accessible to either small businesses or if there are people that live in that area, that they would have access to that, potentially erecting solar panels that shade parking lots, to sort of aid with the urban heat island problem could be another part of that infrastructure where the charging is being partly supported by shading solar panels in the area and that sort of thing. Those are some of the ideas that I can think of in terms of partnering with communities. And of course, if you have infrastructure for charging, then you could put your fleet of electric vehicles or golf carts in the neighborhoods that maybe need more support for transportation, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're using that term partner, I think, deliberately in this context because this cannot be a top-down, wholly regulatory, thou shalt do this, that, and the other thing. It really needs community buy-in, and we need to find ways to be able to incentivize these things as much as possible, while still, doing some stuff on the regulatory side of things, like Seamus mentioned, where we already put in the zoning code a couple of years back, the need to put in EV charging in new parking lots and remodeled parking lots. And that was very aggressive. And we did that also from an equity basis because not everyone can have their own EV charging at their home. They may live in an apartment. They may live in a condominium or some other type of facility where they can't have one, even if they wanted one and had all the means to do so. So that was meant to try to promote EV adoption because of the need for charging and how public charging is frankly, more and more in demand all the time, which is a good thing. But in our city, we still only have a handful of public chargers, and there's not a single publicly accessible charger in all of Southport, as an example. We need to remedy that, but we need to make sure that we're providing that in areas where people may not be able to do their own EV charging to help promote those adoption of EVs, but then also the car share programs like the gig cars, which are electric and all about giving people options other than going in their own vehicle.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that, if you live in a condo, you may not have a place to charge your vehicle. And with the state mandating that cars in 2035 have to be electric, that's not that far out. And if these folks in condos can't buy a vehicle that they can charge at either their home or their workplace, it could be, we need to start thinking about infrastructure for folks that don't have the privilege of having an EV charging station at their home. I think that's a really important equity issue right now. Are there any other comments from the commission? I don't see any hands raised. So I think it might be time to
motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn from Commissioner Hastain. Is there a second?
Really quickly, before we adjourn, I believe that there's still city reports, which is very brief.
And
I apologize. I've lost my agenda. No motion to adjourn. moving on, city report. If I can find my agenda. Mr. McCoy, do you have city report for us?
I do actually. As the commission is aware, there's staffing issues pretty much throughout the region. We have been working hard to identify staff for the transportation group. You may be aware that Sarah Strand is going to be leaving us. She's currently working out of Seattle, where she has relocated, but still continuing to work for the city until we bring on her replacement. The good news is I do have a verbal acceptance of an offer that was made, and we're looking to get somebody on board relatively shortly, and we'll be re-advertising for another transportation planning position in the very near future to try to fill the associate's level. Other than that, this is the last meeting of the year, so you'll be hearing from us at the beginning of the year, and you'll most likely first thing be getting an introduction to that new staff person.
Thank you very much. Yes, I found my agenda again. General Administration Function Part 3. Our next meeting is on January 3rd, 2022. Thank you for the reports from city staff. That's item B. Item C is future agenda requests by the Transportation and Mobility and Infrastructure Commission. Commissioners, are there any future agenda requests? Commissioner Johnston.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like an update on the role the traffic committee plays in, I guess, just in city government. I noticed that on the commission's page that there was an item for traffic committee, which hasn't met since 2019. And in looking at the prior agendas and minutes of that committee, that really was an avenue for city staff to report to the commission on some of the concerns raised by the public and the residents of the city. Perhaps that's also an option for presenting some of the solutions based on comments submitted on the West Sacramento City Connect app. So just would love an overview of the relationship between that committee and the commission.
Sure. I believe we provided an update. I believe it was last year on that process, and I believe that we can pull that staff report and revive that again. If not, I can take a look and see in advance if it pleases the commission, instead of going and doing the presentation again, I can send the staff report to you, and then I can encourage the commission or commissioners that are interested in getting further clarification to contact me directly. I'd be happy to explain it to them.
Great, thank you. I also want to say, by the way, thank you to everybody who's presented on the climate action change. I neglected to thank folks previously, and I wanted to just say that I appreciate you coming here and giving that presentation. Okay, moving on. Any more requests from the commission for future agenda items? Okay, and with that, we move on to item D, which is motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Aye.
And Commissioner Cianes is a second. And with that, we will adjourn. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.